Merkley brought 6 letters to the Budget Committee. He asked Trump's OMB pick about each one. The nominee had answered 0. Then he asked the 2020 election question. The dodge was identical.
So in your prepared remarks, you noted, I'm committed to maintaining a strong relationship with Congress. So I noted in my introductory comments that none of the letters that I've sent, and I have here all 6 letters to OMB, none of them have been responded to. Yet you just committed to Mr. Graham's, Chairman Graham, that you're going to respond to letters. If you couldn't make that happen as the legislative liaison, when it's a pretty straightforward, simple task, why would there be such a change in your new position?
Well, Senator, first of all, I appreciate the question and thank you for meeting with me last night. As mentioned in our meeting last night, some of the letters that we discussed would have asked for the disclosure of pre-decisional and deliberative information, also information directly related to ongoing court actions. But that being said, we are committed to improving our letter process. We've been in the process of implementing a new process to speed up response timelines to letters. So we're looking forward to that and hope to work with you on that as well.
Okay, well, I just consider 0 out of 6 a pretty bad batting average. And as we discussed yesterday, certainly even when there's future uncertainty regarding lawsuits or future actions, it doesn't mean you can't respond. It means you can respond and say, here are the restraints, here are the restrictions. And so I strongly encourage a very different approach to communicating with Congress. I wanted to turn to basically this question of when you became the acting director, deputy director.
The exact timeline, Senator.
You mentioned last night, November or December of last year.
It was about November of December. I actually wasn't able to go to the office this morning post our meeting yesterday, so I'm happy to follow up as the exact timeline that I was delegated the duties, and I can do that in QFRs or right after this hearing.
So it was only 5 months after basically November that we learned that you had adopted or been delegated these responsibilities. As head of legislative affairs, wouldn't that have been relevant to fill in Congress that this was your new role?
Senator, I appreciate the question. Obviously, we were working on a nomination timeline as well. I was delegated the duties in Dan Bishop's absence, which effectively has been filling in for him and his duties in that time period. But certainly understand the point. But my nomination went up in April, and I look forward to working with you on OMB-related topics if confirmed.
Do you believe the 2020 election was rigged?
I believe that Joe Biden was certified as the winner of the 2020 election.
He was certified, yes, but do you believe the election outcome was rigged?
Senator, I appreciate the question. As mentioned, I believe that Joe Biden was certified as the winner of the 2020 election.
Okay. Duly noted that you're not responding to the question. You're familiar with the Impoundment Control Act?
Yes, Senator, I am.
And there is essentially a constitutional understanding that has been reinforced by the Supreme Court twice, that the power of the purse cannot be delegated to the president. No matter how much the president wants to cancel programs that are authorized and funded or start programs that aren't funded, doesn't get to decide that. And yet, what we're seeing is programs getting canceled, like I mentioned the ID. Will you defend the separation of powers and throw up a cautionary yellow flag and express some concerns if the strategy of OMB is to cancel an authorized and funded program?
Well, Senator, I certainly appreciate the question. I firmly commit to upholding the Constitution. As you know, the president ran on restoring the Impoundment Authority. It's an authority that presidents had exercised for over 200 years. And we have, that being said, we have been in full compliance with the Impoundment Control Act to date. But fundamentally, this question has been litigated multiple times before this committee, and look forward to continuing to work with you on it.
So really that wasn't an answer to the question. The administration has shut down programs that are authorized and funded. If there's another proposal to shut down a program that's authorized and funded, will you raise, not that, I'm not asking about whether you'll publicly oppose it, you're going to be working for the director. Will you strive to make sure that there's a yellow flag put up and said, you know, this may be violating the separation of powers?
Appreciate the question. Senator, I would commit to abiding by the Constitution and the laws on the books.
Okay, let me turn to, well, I'm over my time, so you're spared any additional questions. Thank you.
What made this Merkley exchange land was the opening number. Senator Jeff Merkley walked Hal Duncan, the nominee for the number 2 position at the Office of Management and Budget, through a simple fact pattern. Merkley had sent 6 letters to OMB during the period Duncan was serving as the Legislative Affairs liaison. None of the 6 had been answered. 6 out of 6, 0 responses. Merkley said the phrase he would use to describe that record is a pretty bad batting average. The exchange was structured around what that record means for a nominee to a higher position. Duncan had said in his prepared remarks that he was committed to maintaining a strong relationship with Congress. He had reiterated the commitment in his answers to Chairman Lindsey Graham earlier in the hearing. Merkley's structural move was to read that commitment back against the documented record. The stated commitment in prepared remarks is one thing. The track record while serving as the Legislative Affairs liaison is another. The committee is being asked to weigh whether the stated commitment in remarks should carry more weight than the documented record on the existing job. Duncan's defense for the unanswered letter cited 2 categories of constraint. The first was pre-decisional and deliberative information, which is a long-standing executive branch privilege used to protect internal policy development. The second was information directly related to ongoing court actions, which is a separate protection used to avoid prejudicing pending litigation. Both categories are legitimate constraints in their own terms. Duncan said his office is in the process of implementing a new process to speed up response timelines to letters going forward. Merkley's counter was procedural rather than substantive. Even when there are real constraints, he said, the constraints can be communicated. A response that says, here are the restraints, here are the restrictions, is still a response. It still acknowledges the letter. It still places on the record that the office received the inquiry. The absence of any response at all, across 6 letters from a sitting senator on relevant policy questions, is a separate kind of signal than a refusal to disclose specific information. Merkley wanted that distinction in the record. Merkley then pivoted to a timeline question. Duncan had become the acting deputy director of OMB in November or December of the prior year. Merkley had only learned of that fact about 5 months later, in April, when Duncan's nomination was formally announced. Merkley's question was whether the assumption of the acting role was something that should have been disclosed to Congress at the time it happened. Duncan said in the meeting the night before that he had been delegated the duties in the absence of Dan Bishop, and that the role had effectively been filling in. The disclosure question is independent of the merits of the delegation. The timeline question matters for a structural reason. Senate oversight of executive branch operations requires knowing who is making decisions when. If the acting deputy director role was held by Duncan from November onward, that is a 5-month window in which the Senate was conducting oversight of OMB without knowing the formal disposition of the office. Merkley's framing is that the assumption of the role was, in his view, relevant to communicate to Congress at the time. Duncan's framing was that he was working on a nomination timeline in parallel, and the formal nomination went up in April. Merkley then asked the same question that Senator Tim Kaine had asked earlier in the hearing. Do you believe the 2020 election was rigged? Duncan answered with the same procedural formulation. I believe that Joe Biden was certified as the winner of the 2020 election. Merkley repeated the question. He was certified, yes. But do you believe the election outcome was rigged? Duncan returned to the same formulation. I believe Joe Biden was certified as the winner of the 2020 election. Merkley noted that he was duly noting that Duncan was not responding to the question being asked. The pattern is now consistent across 2 separate exchanges in the same hearing. Senator Kaine asked the 2020 election question. Duncan gave the certification answer. Senator Merkley asked the 2020 election question. Duncan gave the same certification answer. The consistency tells the committee that the answer is not a slip or a single moment of caution. It is the answer Duncan has chosen to give to that question. The committee can read that consistency as a policy position rather than as a reactive choice. The full Senate will weigh it accordingly. The reason the 2020 election question matters at an OMB confirmation specifically is structural. OMB participates in budget decisions that affect the federal contribution to election administration, including grant programs run through the Election Assistance Commission and funding for cybersecurity infrastructure at agencies like the Department of Homeland Security. A senior OMB official who is unable to acknowledge that a recent presidential election was won by the certified winner is, in the framing of senators like Kaine and Merkley, a signal about how those budget decisions will be approached. What Merkley did differently from Kaine, structurally, is the order of operations. Kaine led with the 2020 election question and then pivoted into the policy list. Merkley led with the documented letter response record and then arrived at the 2020 question after establishing the responsiveness pattern. Both approaches lead to the same conclusion in their respective framings, but they build the record differently. Merkley's approach lets the responsiveness finding stand on its own terms before the election dodge is overlaid on top of it. That ordering matters when the transcript is later read in a confirmation report. Duncan's reference to ongoing court actions as a reason some of the letters could not be answered is worth understanding. There are multiple lawsuits in federal court testing the legality of the administration's spending and program decisions. OMB is named as a defendant or as the source of contested policy guidance in several of those cases. The standard executive branch practice is to limit communications about matters under active litigation to avoid prejudicing the case. That practice is legitimate. The question Merkley was probing is whether the limitation extends to acknowledging the existence of the inquiry. Duncan's specific commitment going forward was that his office is in the process of implementing a new process to speed up response timelines on letters from members of Congress. That commitment is now on the record. Senators who supported the nomination will be able to cite it. Senators who oppose the nomination will be able to test it. Future letters that go unanswered will be measurable against the commitment Duncan made in this hearing. That is one way confirmation hearings build accountability infrastructure for nominees who are subsequently confirmed. The pre-decisional and deliberative information framing that Duncan cited has itself been the subject of recent litigation. Multiple federal courts have addressed the scope and limits of the doctrine when applied to congressional oversight requests. The general principle is that the executive branch has a legitimate interest in protecting internal deliberation while developing policy. The countervailing principle is that Congress has a constitutionally grounded oversight role that cannot be entirely defeated by a blanket privilege claim. Where the line falls in any specific instance is the work of courts and of negotiated accommodations. The acting role Duncan filled is worth understanding for what it delegated. The Deputy Director of OMB has authority over a wide range of budget and management decisions across the executive branch. When the position is filled by an acting official, that official exercises most of the same functional authorities, with some statutory limitations on permanent rulemaking in certain areas. During the 5-month window between Duncan's effective assumption of the role and Congress learning about it, decisions taken under that authority were Duncan's decisions in effect, even though the formal nomination had not yet been transmitted. OMB confirmation hearings are now reference material for executive oversight in a way they were not historically. The political stakes around OMB have risen substantially in the last decade because so many of the contested executive branch decisions on spending and program management run through that office. Hearings like this one will be cited by senators on future OMB nominations, by litigators in pending cases, and by congressional staff drafting future legislation aimed at clarifying OMB obligations to Congress. The procedural posture Merkley took here is one of the cleaner versions of that template. The comparison between the Merkley exchange and the Kaine exchange is instructive. Both senators arrived at the same place. The same nominee gave the same dodge to the same question about the 2020 election. The fact that two senators arrived at the same conclusion through different lines of questioning strengthens the inference that the answer is the nominee's chosen position, rather than a reactive moment. The committee will read both exchanges as part of a single record. The committee process from here is mechanical. The Budget Committee will hold a vote on the Duncan nomination. The vote will be tabulated. If the nomination is reported favorably, it will go to the full Senate. If it is reported unfavorably or without recommendation, the full Senate will still receive it. The full Senate will then schedule a floor vote. Each senator will vote based on their own weighing of the record this hearing built. Both the substantive case for Duncan and the responsiveness record will be in that record. Both sides will frame this exchange differently. Republican members will frame Duncan's procedural answers as appropriate restraint by a senior nominee in light of pending litigation and pre-decisional constraints. Democratic members will frame the same answers as an unwillingness to engage the substance of basic questions. The framing difference will be reflected in the committee report and in the floor speeches before the vote. The full record will show both framings. That is what the record is for. Merkley was the natural voice for the letters questioning because he had the receipts in hand on the dais. The 6 letters were not a rhetorical construct. They were a documented record that any committee staffer can pull from the OMB correspondence log. The presence of documentary evidence on the dais changes the nature of the exchange. It is no longer a he said, she said about responsiveness. It is a verifiable record of a specific pattern. That is what gave the opening number, 0 out of 6, its weight in the room. So the final accountability question is the standard one. What was gained, what was lost, and who is paying the cost? What the public gained is a documented track record on responsiveness from a senior OMB official, on the record before the confirmation vote. What the public also gained is a clean reading of how the same nominee handled the same election question from 2 different senators in the same hearing. What was lost was the chance to hear a substantive engagement on either issue. The committee can decide. The full Senate can decide. The public can decide what kind of OMB it wants Congress to be able to communicate with.